Hello, everyone. I promised to do a review video of the final exam study guide. So I'm going to do it, and I'm going to send it to you. This is something just to give you a sense of what I was getting at in the questions, how I might go about it. I can't answer these questions in the fullest sense for you, but I would like to give you some pointers. Question one: how would you go about solving a moral problem from a utilitarian point of view? That is something that you should feel very comfortable doing. And I would just review the chapter on utilitarianism in our textbook, and just keep in mind what its fundamental principles are. Um, as a normative theory, it has certain ideas about how people should act and what the basic principles are of morality. It's really just a matter of applying them. But it's this. I will probably ask you not to outline what the utilitarian approach is, but to actually demonstrate your knowledge of it by looking at a fictional case study like this one about Joe the plagiarist. So that's what you should expect. That is, you should expect maybe not this particular case study or scenario, but something that will ask you to think like a utilitarian. How would a utilitarian evaluate Joe's actions here? Joe the plagiarist, Joe the good person who is kind of behind and stuck and ends up buying a paper and handing it in as his own work and getting away with that. How would a utilitarian view this? I don't think there's one answer. It may seem that there's an obvious answer, but again, look at the chapter. Look at not only what utilitarianism is, but there's different forms of utilitarianism. Would you approach this as an act utilitarian or as a rule utilitarian? I think it would make a big difference. So, yeah, what you're going to need to do is to write an ethical analysis of something like this. Maybe not this particular one, but something similar as a utilitarian. And it should be thorough and it should be thoughtful and it should come to some sort of conclusion from a utilitarian point of view. Again, it's not really your bare opinion about Joe, the ethics of Joe's action, but really about what you think the utilitarian answer would be in terms of an ethical judgment on what Joe did and why. Very similar will be the second question would be very similar, except from a Kantian point of view. How would you go about solving a moral problem from a Kantian point of view? Again, we could look back at Joe the plagiarist, and sorry, I thought I was showing the Joe plagiarism thing, but apparently I'm not. This is the one I mean. I think that this should come up now. Yeah, it was the. I think we looked at it in class maybe a little bit. How would a Kantian view this? Joe is in trouble. He's in danger of losing his scholarship and not graduating, and this would, have big impacts on him. So he does something to deal with the problem, and that something involves deception and things like that. How would Kant view this, or a Kantian? And again, it's not really a vague question. There are actual principles you can apply, and obviously in utilitarianism, the principle of utility, the greatest happiness principle, is going to be vital. But with a Kantian analysis, the categorical imperatives, the first two at least, are absolutely essential. You can't do a Kantian analysis of anything without applying the first two categorical imperatives, and you know what I mean. The first categorical imperative about universalizability of maxims, rules of action, and the second one involving treating how you're supposed to treat persons and treating them as ends in themselves rather than as means and things like that. So, yeah, you should demonstrate your ability to approach things from either a Kantian or a utilitarian point of view. The Thomas Aquinas point of view is certainly not as easy to specify, like what that actually means. We know that, but just to give you a sense of how I'm thinking, we know that for Thomas, the fundamental first principle, self-evident first principle of natural law is the idea that the good should be pursued and evil avoided. The trick in making that into a useful analytical tool for actually approaching something, say, like the Joe plagiarism situation, is to think in terms of what are the goods. And he has certain ideas about how we can find out about the goods. And that was much of what I had to say about Thomas Aquinas is how do we actually begin to specify what the goods are. And that has to do with looking at our own nature, our own God-given nature, what we're inclined towards, where we're inclined to find good in the first place. Number 5, explain how, despite conceding at the start that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, Judith Jarvis Thompson can argue that abortion is morally defensible. That is one of the many striking things about Thompson's essay, is that her argument is a defense, a moral defense of abortion. But one of the first things that she does is concedes that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, which would seem to be conceding quite a bit to the anti-abortion argument. So the trick in understanding her essay and what she has to say about abortion is essentially how can she do that? Because of course persons have a right to life. So she's conceded that the fetus has a right to life. So killing it would seem to be immoral from the outset. So I'm not going to give it away, but the trick with Thompson is to see how, even though she's granting that the fetus from the moment of conception has a right to life, she can still argue that abortion is, at least in some cases, not in every case perhaps, morally defensible. Number 6, I would just like you to show your knowledge of her essay by maybe discussing some of the fictional scenarios, hypotheticals that she comes up with. They're so good, and they're so knowing them is such a good way of getting into the issues that she's talking about. Of course, the unconscious violinist, that is the first one that she gives, the most important one. There's several variations on it, but essentially you wake up and find that there is an unconscious human being attached intravenously to you. What are your rights and their rights in that situation? Very, very important for her argument about abortion. The two boys, I think they're brothers, in the box of chocolates. Remember that there's two scenarios, one of which the older brother is given the box of chocolates individually and then selfishly eats them in front of his brother. The other one in which they're given the box of chocolates jointly and he selfishly eats them. To see how those two situations differ and what point she's making about justice and rights is quite important. The third and fourth one, people seeds, excuse me, and the expanding baby, maybe not as central, but still easily found in the essay and very well explained by her. Number 7, what is Don Marquis' total argument that, excuse me, that concludes that abortion is prima facie, on the face of it, seriously immoral. Remember, the structure of Marquis' argument about abortion is that it starts with a general theory of the wrongness of killing. And that's a very definite argument that he gives about the wrongness of killing. And it's absolutely essential to understand his argument for the wrongness of killing because it's that general argument about the wrongness of killing that determines his argument about the wrongness of abortion. So you just simply have to start where he starts and end up where he ends up. And he starts with a general theory of the wrongness of killing and applies it to abortion. Number 8, what is Peter Singer's total argument about giving in both its forms. It's a short argument. It's only got two premises, right? Um, starts out, about certain things are bad, and then the both its forms part is that there's only two premises to the argument, which is essentially that certain things are bad, and then that's the first premise, and then the second premise, which has to do with what we ought to do to prevent bad things. It's got two forms. Remember that one is more demanding than the other, and one of them has to do with comparable moral worth as opposed to or comparable moral importance. Excuse me, sacrifices of comparable moral importance as opposed to sacrifices of things which are of no moral importance. Right, and to see how one is more demanding than the other is really crucial. Number nine, why does Singer think that even in its more moderate form, and that would be the second version of his second premise of his argument, that accepting his argument would revolutionize our whole way of life? That's really, you got to sit down and read it, and he tells you why. Right? That is, even in its less demanding form, if you really accepted and then lived by his argument, it would revolutionize our whole way of life in terms of essentially what we thought our duties were to others and what we thought we had a right to do with our disposable income. Finally, and this really relies upon the last day of class. So if you were there in the last day of class, good for you. Explain how John Arthur goes about critiquing Singer's argument. I don't feel, I mean, you got to read it. It's very well explained. But as a way of characterizing that critique, remember, he's not totally rejecting Singer. He's not saying Singer is entirely wrong. What he's saying is Singer is too simple and that his forward looking, so called forward looking utilitarian or consequentialist view is only part of our, what Arthur calls our moral code. That other things, crucial things, I'm not going to say what they are, but other crucial considerations that he calls backward looking are essential too. So that's what I had in mind when I wrote these questions for the study guides. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you at the final exam.